broad from the energy sector's perspective, people that are new, even for ISO veterans and just people that are just curious about what happens here at the ISO. So we're going to be taking you on through this lesson. The goal for today is for us to give you this information, but it's also going to be interactive. So let me give you guys some additional information here. What we're going to talk about today is going to be some of the ISO foundations. So we'll talk about the roles, we'll talk about the structure, and we'll talk about how we coordinate. We'll talk about some of the functions, so we'll talk about planning, markets, and reliability, and then how we participate. So the policy and initiatives, stakeholder process, the ISO web tools, and training. Now, this session is going to be recorded, so if you would like to hear this or share this with additional people at the end of this class, this will be posted to the Learning Center in about 3 to 5 days after today, along with the slides that I'm going to be showing to you today. The slides that are going to be included will have some of the information that I'll be covering today, so that way you can read through it. And then along with some of the other information are going to be additional webinar slides and links that'll give you guys some information on how to continue your knowledge and your studying about what's going on here at the California ISO. Now, we're going to have a break about midway through, so that way you can get up and stretch, get some water, and then recharge and come back and be ready to take on the second half. Again, what I will encourage you guys to do is use the chat pod to send your questions to Heidi, so that way we can get them, and then we will share those questions with the group, because sometimes what I've found as an instructor is that one person will have a question and multiple people have the question, but only one person wants to ask. That way you can get the information out, we can all share from the knowledge. If this is information that's not included in the slide, what we can do is also make sure to include that in the slide information if it's something that's important that's left out, so that way when we post this, you guys will have that information. If it's something that we can't answer right away, we can always email an answer to you, or you can submit a city ticket to make sure that we get those things cleared. So now, just a couple of housekeeping items. To make sure you keep yourself muted, and this allows for us to keep the conversation flowing. For those of you that are familiar with virtual training, you know how it works, that if a couple people start talking, sounds cut out, and we want to make sure that we give you guys the information. So if you can keep your phones on mute, that'll help us monitor the background noise. Again, if you do have a question, you can put it in the chat pod, so that way Heidi can get it, and then we can either ask it verbally or we can respond to the chat. But just make sure if you send your question to us, make sure that you send it to everyone, so that way we can see the question, everyone can take advantage of the knowledge. You can also, if it's a complex question, what you can do is raise your hand, and then Heidi will alert me that the hand is raised, and then we can ask the question verbally. And again, then we can get the information for everyone to share. So now, before we get started, let's take a look at a couple of other things. As I mentioned, this presentation will be listed in the Learning Center for the California ISO. You can find this on our website at kaiso.com, and it'll have this information. In addition, there will be a list of computer-based trainings, or CBTs, that will give you additional information to supplement the information I'm going to give you today. You will also have previously recorded training sessions that will cover some of the other topics, so we'll get into things like settlements, the day-ahead market, real-time, things like that, that you will have some information, so that way you can get some further information to expand your knowledge. So let's talk about what we're here for. So now the North American energy regions share the goal of maintaining reliability and market efficiency. How do we do that? Well, approximately 2/3 of the United States and half of Canada is broken up into 9 energy regions. So now the independent systems operators, or RTOs, and the RTOs, or the regional transmission operators, are the federally regulated regional organizations that perform the functions of coordinating and controlling the energy. So now our job is to make sure that we get things to the right place at the right time. So similar to a stock exchange, the ISO never actually owns or takes title to the energy. And that's important to understand as we go through this conversation, is that we just act as the mechanism to bring the sellers of the energy and the buyers of the energy together. And that's the important thing. Now, the California ISO is one of the entities that resides in a regional area known as the Western Interconnection. Now, though the ISOs and RTOs have different ways of operating their grids and markets, we all participate together in the ISO RTO Council, and And that's committed to work together to build a smarter and more efficient grid that is prepared to meet the North American market and consumer needs. So now, during this session, we're going to be focusing on the California ISO, but it's important to note that if you're working with a different ISO, be aware that some of the differences and some of the similarities, they may operate slightly differently, and the terminology will be specific to the California ISO, but you will notice that there's some similarities. So please ask questions if we don't cover something that sounds like it might be something that you're looking forward to. So now, like many of the other ISOs, the California ISO is a nonprofit public benefit corporation. So what does that mean? So we're responsible for the constant and reliable flow of electricity for the health, safety, and welfare of consumers, but unlike a public utility, we're profit neutral. We're independent, and we do not serve the end users. So now we operate the transmission system, but not the distribution lines. So those are operated and maintained by the utilities. So we get it from point A to point B, but once it's time to get from the substation to your house, that's owned and run by the utilities. Now, they perform maintenance on the generators and the transmissions. So our job, unlike the utilities, we don't own any of those things. We do not take ownership of any of the energy. We just help make sure that it gets from point A to point B. Now, the ISO facilitates a fair and transparent wholesale electricity market. So we accomplish that through proper planning and initiatives, and we provide state-of-the-art technology that allows for enhanced situational awareness of the state of the bulk electric system. So that's the BES, and we'll hear us talk about that later. Now, our job is for the grid operators to maintain reliability, to keep the lights on, which is important. You guys can see me today because we're doing the right job to make sure that the lights are on. So now, part of that is a comprehensive transmission planning process to accommodate the need for system expansion to include more renewable energy resources for a clean, green, renewable energy sufficiency. Now, we actively engage in state, federal entities to support the policy and regional goals to, have more distributed and clean power produced to provide coordination over a larger geographical area to enhance reliability and to lower costs. So now, as I mentioned, the ISO is located in the Western Interconnection, which is represented here. Now, in addition to being an ISO, an independent system operator, we're also registered as a balancing authority. Now, while all ISOs are BAs, not all BAs are ISOs. Now, the balancing authority area is a combination of intertie points and resources, and the balancing authority is responsible for matching generation and load while maintaining the electric efficiency of the grid. Got to maintain that frequency. We're going to talk about that frequency more in a bit. Now, there are nearly 40 operating separate BAs in the West, each of them with the same core functions, preparing the system for the next day, and then using the resources within their boundaries. Now, by taking into account all the import and export energy from the neighboring BAs and matching changing supply with demand in the real time. Now, the ISO is the largest BA. So the ISO is the largest BA in this region, handling about 36% of the electric load in the Western Interconnection, and that's a pretty large portion. Now, utilities such as investor-owned utilities or public utilities inside the boundaries of the BAA and their energy, they share some of the resources throughout the entire interconnection and enhance the reliability through a greater resource pool. So think about if we can put all of those things together, how can we maximize the efficiency? And I'm going to show you guys how that works within the ISO. Now, also our goal is going to be to, again, we talk about achieving renewable targets, making our carbon footprint less, and making sure that we add more of those clean, green resources to the grid. Now, as this energy is shared between the BAAs, the continual communication and just how we track the information and share that utilization of the information leads to better situational awareness and more grid efficiency. Now, E-tax or the electric tax tracks the energy that is scheduled to flow between BAAs. Now, the ETAGs contain the data that we use to model where and how much energy is consumed and what the transmission lines are being utilized for and reliability, and we also use that for settlements. So now there's a lot of information that goes on to maintain that reliability. So we have a couple of groups of people that do those things. So now as a grid operator, the ISO makes sure that within the balancing area, every BA uses means to accomplish this. So the grid operator supports reliability by balancing the supply and demand. They're going to make sure that the operating transmission system is operating within its limits. Operating outside of that means unreliability, instability, and then we run into issues. Now, ensuring the grid is secure in case of contingency events. So as you've seen over the past few years, things happen, but we still need to be able to prepare for those and plan for those. And orchestrating a restoration in case of a system outage is critical also. But then what about the market operators? So from a market standpoint, what do? Well, they support reliability, providing a larger operational footprint. They look at the bigger picture. They talk about cost optimization to balance supply versus demand. And as non-discriminatory grid access to the supply and demand, so we have to make sure that we're operating fairly. There's price transparency reflective in the system conditions, and you can find this information on our website, and I'll show you where those resources are. And then there's a compensation for grid services. Now, on November 1st, 2019, the ISO became the official reliability coordinator of record for over 40 electric balancing authorities and transmission operators across 14 western states and northern Mexico. Now, a reliability coordinator has the highest level of authority and responsibility for the reliable operation of power grids and has wide visibility to the BES, bulk electric system. Now, the RC West monitors the interconnected power in the grids in the West for compliance and federal regulation standards. Now, this determines measures to prevent or mitigate system emergencies in the day-ahead or real-time operations, and lead system restorations for major incidents. Now, RC West has oversight in power grid reliability for balancing authorities and transmission operators for the Western Interconnection and monitoring compliance for 87% of that area. So how do we do this? Well, we have to adhere to the strict oversight. So who do we report to? Well, the FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is an independent U.S. federal entity that is a regulator for our market and has jurisdiction over interstate electricity sales, wholesale electric rates, natural gas, and oil pipelines. They also talk about reliability standards for the bulk power system. Now, the FERC reviews the ISO's market rules and transmission rates to ensure that they are both just and reasonable and do not create undue preferences or discrimination under the Federal Power Act. Now, NERC is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and it is the international regulatory authority whose mission is to secure the reliability and security of the bulk power system for North America. Now, NERC works with all stakeholders to develop and enforce standards for power system operation, physical and cybersecurity, and security operator preparedness, and enforces compliance with those standards. Now, they also work with the NAESB, which is the North American Energy Standards Board, to develop standards, including e-tagging standards, and those are the things that we talked about earlier for making sure that we have the correct data. Now, the WEC, which is the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, is a nonprofit corporation responsible for coordinating and promoting bulk electric systems, so the BES reliability, in the geographical area known as the Western Interconnection. And that's what we talked about on the previous slide. So all these things go into not only maintaining reliability, but we talked about transparency, fairness, and making sure that it is reliable and we can keep the grid running at a certain frequency. In order to do that and working across different state lines and with different entities, there has to be some rules that we all agree upon, and these are the entities that give us those rules to work by. So now, how are things run here at the ISO? So I'm going to show you guys a chart so so you can see some of the people you'll be working with here at the ISO. So the first thing is the Board of Governors, the relationship between the departments, committees, and regional entities. Now, our board is comprised of 5 members that each serve a staggered 3-year term and are appointed by the California governor. Our Department of Marketing Monitoring is responsible for ensuring that the market remains competitive by analyzing market trends and market initiatives, identifying potential anti-competitive market behaviors and market inefficiencies, and enforcing FERC decisions to really make sure that we, again, are staying in compliance. Now, in order to provide transparency, the Department of Market Monitoring produces regular reports that are available on our website. The DMM is overseen by our Department of Marketing Monitoring Oversight Committee, and that board group reports directly to the board. Now, we also have the Audit Committee tasked with making sure that the oversight for the ISO's budget and financial operations. You guys know how the Audit Committee works. Make sure everything is right within that task. Now, the Western EIM governing body is ancillary to the Board of Governors and exercises delegated authority from the Board of Governors over the Western Energy Imbalance Market rules. Now, though not pictured here, it is important to note that 2 other groups in the EIM governing body we're close with, and that's the body of state regulatory and in the Regional Issues Forum. Now, the body of state regulators includes representation from 8 states responsible for advising the EIM governing body and the ISO board members of matters of interest, while the Regional Issues Forum is the public vehicle for stakeholders to really discuss the EIM-related issues that impact neighboring DAAs. Now, the current structure here at the ISO is the following. So as of late 2020, our president and CEO, Elliot Mainzer, took a newly created role, and then we also have that with Mark Rothlater, which is our Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. He's responsible for operations, policy, technology, and infrastructure in the departments to better align the efforts to really develop and maintain a solid grid infrastructure, to improve market performance through market design, working with state regulators, integrating renewables into the market, and really managing the market and the system applications, as well as all the corporate applications to really keep the highest standard of cybersecurity critical to ensure that the safety of the grid. Now, market operating systems for our customers are important as well, so we need to maintain grid reliability by running a robust market, operating the bulk electric system, and providing oversight through reliability coordination and through the managing process from bids all the way to settlements. Now, I know this is the first time we talk about bids and settlements, and we'll get into this later, but this is what all goes on right here at the ISO. Now, other notable divisions include our legal and regulatory teams that work with the ISO tariffs and interact with the FERC, the NERC, and the WEC that we just talked about, and other agencies when it comes to filing compliance and regulations. Now, the external and customer affairs, both within the ISO footprint and the regional level, these interactions cover everyday questions as forward-looking policies such as improvements to the ISO markets, EIM, and regional integration. So now those of us on the customer readiness team are part of the external customer service affairs team. Now, the ISO, with all of these different functions, imperative that all these groups work together to really effectively manage the grid. So now, how does the ISO coordinate with state agencies, and who are these? Now, though we're not a state agency, we work with agencies to implement state policy, perform studies, and facilitate a fair and transparent wholesale electric market to drive innovation. So now the Air Resources Board's mission is to promote and protect public health, welfare, and ecological resources through the effective and efficient reduction of air pollutants while recognizing and considering the effects of the state's economy. One of their main focuses is limiting greenhouse gas emissions, which we all agree is important, and they do that through programs that utilize renewable energy credits, so those are RECs, And generators can purchase these RECs in order to offset air emissions and continue to operate their facilities. Now, the California Energy Commission, or the CEC, is responsible for certification of electrical generation facilities as eligible renewable energy resources and adopting regulations for enforcement of renewable portfolio standards, or RPS. Now, procurement requirements for the publicly owned utilities are the RPS. Now, RPS is currently set at 60% total energy procurement from eligible renewable sources by 2030, and the ISO is actively working towards helping achieve this goal. Now, we'll also work with the California State and Assembly to effect a change within the industry. Now, the Water Resources Control Board is focusing on once-through cooling issues, and we have a number of generators in California that are close to the coast and use seawater to aid in the conversion process of condensing steam back into water, which have detrimental effects on marine habitats. Now, the Water Resources Control Board is coordinating a long-term effort with resources to find alternative ways to cool these plants or possibly retire them. And now, the ISO also works with the California Public Utilities Commission on resource adequacy and generation procurement. Now, the CPUC implements and administers RPS compliance rules for California's retail sellers or electricity, which includes large and small investor-owned utilities, electric service providers, and community choice aggregators. Now, the CPUC adopted a resource adequacy, or RA, policy framework in 2004 in order to ensure reliability of the electric service in California. Now, the CPUC established RA obligations applicable to all load-serving entities, or LSEs, within the CPUC's jurisdiction. Now, the Commission's RA program guides resource procurement and promotes infrastructure investment, requiring that LSEs procure capacity so that capacity is available to the ISO when and where needed. Now, again, when we talked about having a reliable, efficient grid, all of these things go together to ensure that those are happening. Now, the Integrated Resource Plan is an umbrella plan proceeding to consider all of the Commission's electric procurement policies and programs and ensure California has a safe, reliable, and cost-effective electric supply. Now, as I mentioned before, though we're not a state agency, we do help shape the policies and affect the grid and grid operations. So it's a great benefit for us to work closely with these entities inside California to also work with agencies outside of California, since we all work together. And how do we do that? So there's a robust stakeholder process for customers that want to be involved. So now we don't work with just the regulatory agencies and oversight boards and state agencies. Partnership with our stakeholders is critical to the success of ISO also. So now stakeholder input is essential to the ISO planning process and success of new initiatives, from policy development to implementation. We encourage you to participate in the stakeholder engagement process also. On our website, under the Stay Informed tab, and I'll show you guys where this is located later, you will see information on our stakeholder initiatives. This page lists all of the initiatives we're working on at the ISO and provides all of the papers and meeting invitation schedules, so that way initiatives you should be interested in how to participate in the discussion. Now, we're committed to providing the opportunity for stakeholder input into our planning process, our market design, our implementation, infrastructure, planning activities, all of these things. Now, the stakeholder process will help shape market design and policies through a series of proposals, meetings, comment periods, including any changes to our tariff. So again, when we talk about at the end of this session, and I provide you guys with the PowerPoint on the website, go through and take a look at these things. These are critical for us to make sure that not only are we doing the right thing, but we're including you guys in the process. And it's important for us to do that. So what are the rules, guidelines, and instructions that define market and reliability processes? So a great deal of the documentation that we adhere to from a reliability and safety standpoint is defined by federal and regulatory standards. Our primary document is our tariff, which outlines the rates, terms, and conditions under which the ISO operates. Now, the tariff is modified in collaboration with our stakeholders through our stakeholder process, which we just talked about. Now, pertinent FERC rules are codified in our tariff, so any wholesale exchange of electricity in our markets comes under their purview. To view our tariff and associated filings in a more user-friendly way, you can visit the eTariff viewer that offers the convenient access to all ISO-related files and part of the FERC's eTariff system. Now, we also have business practice manuals, or BPMs. Now, the rules and tariffs can be really high level and at times, so our BPMs provide detailed rules and the procedures and processes, and it gives you examples of the administration, operation planning, accounting requirements of the California ISO, and the markets that are consistent with the ISO tariff. Adherence to the manual is important for the orderly operation of the ISO market. Now, operating procedures guide the critical step-by-step actions of the control room task. Now, some of these procedures are posted on our website, while others are pretty confidential, as you can imagine. So before I get into what the primary functions are of the California ISO, let me pause right here and see what questions you have for us so far. Do we have any questions, Heidi?
I'm not seeing any questions right now, but I just put in a reminder that if you do, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I do have that open and monitoring that. And also, if you wanted to raise your hand, if you want to ask a verbal question, please feel free to do that as well, and we'll call on you. Thanks. But still not seeing anything, so we can go ahead and move along. But feel free, again, you can put your questions in at any time, and we will address those, when we can at a break, or if it's something that's, really important to be covered at a particular time, then I might, interrupt Rodney just a bit. But no questions at this time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Heidi.
You know what? One just came in, and it is from Abu, and it says, what are some of these contingency conditions in the grid?
So there are different contingency events in the grid. So a good example would be like if there was a fire, if you guys remember there's fires that take out some of the transmission lines, different weather conditions. Heidi, what's a good example, easily definable example of some contingencies that we would deal with regularly?
Well, that was good, what you said about fire monitoring, because that could, fires do affect transmission lines. And so our grid operators are working to mitigate that, find other lines that are not threatened. So they might have to, that could create a contingency condition. Like you said, weather, if there's a lot of hot weather, everybody's turning on their air conditioners, we might not have enough resources available. That could create contingency conditions, congestion, resources that may not be available that are expected. So it's a wide variety, and that's what our operators are monitoring. Our systems are monitoring for. So those are some of the things, the major ones, but it could just be outages of resources as well. And then the follow-up question is, and what steps taken by ISO to maintain the supply and demand during a contingent condition? Do you want to cover that, Rodney, or do you want?
Well, we are going to actually cover that when we get to how the markets run. So I think this is a good place to pivot, and we will put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it when we talk about how we actually procure market in both the day ahead and the real time. Does that sound like a good resolution, Heidi?
I think that sounds really good. So great questions, Abu, and we will be getting to that. So thank you very much.
So now the ISO is registered with NERC as a balancing authority, a transmission operator, a transmission service provider, a planning coordinator, a market operator, reliability coordinator. Now, all these things together really help us get to where we can plan, monitor, and help grow the market. So let's talk about how we do that. So now transition planning is a comprehensive evaluation that requires coordination. So transition planning at the ISO is an open, transparent process, and we talked about the stakeholder process, but that actively engages in the stakeholder process and uses the best engineering analysis possible to determine short and long-term infrastructure needs of the ISO transmission grid, which is comprised of over 26,000 circuit miles to maintain reliability and bring economic benefits to consumers. Now, the ISO works closely with the CPUC and the CEC throughout the transmission planning process to identify and study reliability, policy-driven, and economically driven needs. So what does that look like? So the annual transmission planning process. Now, the annual transmission process begins and lasts about 15 months, and the process has two phases for the project: definition and evaluation, and a possible third for the competitive solicitation for selected projects. So phase one, we develop forward-looking assumptions. We take a look at everything that we have, the data that we have. Okay, so what is this going to look like going forward? Then in phase two, we perform analyses and identifying transmission needs. So that way, when we get to the third phase and we have to go through the approval for the ISO board, and now we can select proposals to build the needed transmission projects. So it is a definite process that we go through, that we build upon, and it's very structured so that way we can manage these things ahead of time. So now the generation interconnection coordination brings new resources to the grid. So again, we're talking about how do we incorporate the things you see on the screen into the market. So just as we have a transmission planning process, we also have a robust generator interconnection process to really help resources interconnect with the ISO grid. Now, our streamlined process helps secure the process to ensure that the requirements compliance information, as well as the assigned interconnection specialist, to walk through the entity on the entire process from the beginning all the way through commercial operation. So let's take a high-level look at what this looks like. So here's the interconnection process map. So at a high level, the generator interconnection process starts when the resource submits a request to interconnect. And this kicks off the generator interconnection study to determine the reliability implications and the impacts of the system and identify any upgrades that need to be made. And the process takes just over 2 years to complete. After the study and approval move forward, then the interconnection agreements are signed, and then the new resource implementation, the NRI process, begins. Now, once this process is complete, the resource can begin participating in the market. Now, the tariff allows for 7 years for this project to reach its commercial operation date after the interconnection request is submitted. Now, an important item to note is how critical it is to pay attention to the dates and the deadlines. Now, it is important to keep all projects moving forward as many processes are linked and feed to one another. So one of the main tasks of the queue management system, the QMS, is to make sure the projects in the queue or processes are moving along and interconnection customers are meeting their dates to ensure the generation resources can be interconnected in an efficient manner. Because this is such a complex process, we have to keep this moving because there's tests along the way, there's things we need to do to really ensure this reliability. So meeting these deadlines and adhering to these milestones is critical to the success. So we have to manage that. So once we get to that point, then we talk about now what do we do now that we're into the actual markets of the system. So before I move into that, let's pause here and see what questions we have.
Not seeing any hands raised for verbal questions, and not seeing any additional questions in the chat.
Okay. So now, what is our focus? So our focus is going to be really acting. We are a competitive energy market, so the most BAs do not have. So as a registered market operator, we act as a marketplace for wholesale power and basically a clearinghouse under the exclusive jurisdiction of FERC. So adequate resources for full day's operations are procured, confirmed, and optimized by two different markets that are ensure reliability and make sure that we have everything set to go. So now these two markets are as listed. Now the day-ahead energy market procures resources to meet reliabilities for assurance a day in advance, hence the name the day-ahead market. Now, the job of the day-ahead market is to ensure that there are adequate resources available, deliverable in the real time. Now, this enables parties with bilateral agreements to schedule their contracted supply and demand into the market. They can offload excess supply in the form of energy or ancillary services and secure pricings due to changes in load forecasts or for incremental changes in demand. Now, most demand is met in advance of the market through utility-owned or bilaterally procured resources. Now, the ISO's real-time market, it has this hour-ahead process, so the HAS, hour-ahead scheduling process, which enables import and export resources to schedule their megawatt hourly, as well as the 15-minute market, or the FMM, that allows for variable energy resources, VERS, VERs, such as wind and solar, to submit energy forecasts and economic bids closer to financially binding intervals, which increase bid accuracy. The 5-minute market is intended to meet the instantaneous demand that shows up in real time. So as you all know, as Heidi said before, things such as weather, different contingencies can come in, but just the change in demand. So the temperature could change. People could reduce their consumption for their air conditioning, or the temperature could raise unexpectedly. And how do we meet that demand? That's what the real-time market is going to allow for us to do. So now we need to figure out how do we manage those things. Now, physical energy is electricity needed to meet the needs of the balancing authority area. So energy is the actual physical the product. In general, much of the energy used within California is procured through bilateral contracts outside the ISO markets, in which supply is purchased under contract to meet demand. This energy needs to be scheduled into the ISO market so that the ISO can use information to monitor the physical energy flows on the system. Now, in most cases, energy that is procured outside the California ISO markets is submitted as a self-schedule. Now, the day-ahead market enables suppliers to submit market energies not under contract, enables buyers to procure additional supply in the event they do not have under contract to meet their demand. Now, we use demand forecasts, which allow us to know how much energy will be needed in real time to meet the load requirements. The ISO must project how much energy will be needed and how much will be available for the next day, the day after that, next week, next month, next year, and we do that through robust forecasting practices. Now, the more accurate the data we have, the more accurate the demand forecast. Therefore, the ISO is consistently working on improving load, wind, and solar forecasts in the day-ahead market, the hour ahead, in real-time timeframes to keep the lights on and ensure that the costs are lower for you, the consumer. So how do we do that? We need to understand what's going on with all of this data that's coming into us. So where does that information go? So let's take a look at how the timelines for the day ahead, the real time, and the post market affect each other. So let me give you a brief overview of the market timelines. Now, we just talked about both the day ahead and real time markets, and this diagram will show you the relationship between the two. And as you can see, they're very similar, which is important to note. Now, the day ahead market opens 7 days before the trade date and closes at 10 a.m. the day before. And the day-ahead market is made up of 3 markets that run sequentially. First, the ISO runs a market power mitigation test. Bids that fail the test are revised to predetermined limits. These market power mitigation measures are intended to provide the means for the ISO to mitigate the market for the effects of any conduct that would substantially distort the competitive outcomes in the ISO markets while avoiding unnecessary interference with competitive prices. Again, we talked about fair and transparent pricing. This is one of the processes we have in place to make sure that happens. The second process is the integrated forward market, which establishes the generation need to meet bid and demand. Now, market prices set are based on bids. And last, the residual unit commitment process, the RUC process, secures capacity for additional resources in order to meet the forecasted demand for that day. Now, these processes are co-optimized to produce a day-ahead schedule at least cost while meeting local reliability needs. Now, the final step of the day-ahead market is to publish the results at approximately 1,300 hours. Now, when the day-ahead market is published, this triggers the opening of the real-time market. So now bids are once again submitted along the base schedules from our EIM participants. Market processes run, bids clear the market, dispatch orders are received and sent. The market is then settled in our post-markets process. So let's talk about a little bit further, get down one step lower to make sure we understand that. Now, the day-ahead market determines the amount of energy that will be purchased for each hour. Now, this graph represents 1 hour in the day-ahead market. Now, scheduling coordinators can submit different bid curves for each hour of the day. All the economic bids and self-schedules are both supply and demand are placed on the curve. After we discuss the market processes, I'll take a little detour and talk about the different types of bids. Now, on the left, we have bid prices. Along the bottom, we have the megawatts. This is a very simplified version, but the green curve, the green supply curve represents supply bids are lined up from the least expensive to the most expensive. The blue line has demand bids, what the demand is willing to pay, and it is lined up from most expensive to least expensive. Now, where these two lines cross represents the amount of supply and demand in megawatts that will clear the market in the day-ahead market. Now, what does it mean to clear the market? If a resource submits a successful bid and will therefore be contributing its generation to meet the demand, it is said to have cleared the market. Now, the cheapest resource will clear the market first, followed by the next cheapest option, so on and so forth, until all of the demand is met. Now, when the supply matches the demand, the market is cleared, and the price of the last resource to offer in, plus other market operation charges, becomes the wholesale price of the power. Now, let me pause right there before I jump into the next step, because I want to make sure that we understand this portion. Are there any questions about how we determine the price for this hour? All right, I'm not hearing any questions.
Yep, I don't see any questions that are coming in, and I don't see any hands raised for questions. So,
thank you, Heidi. Now, the market also procures capacity or ancillary services to meet reliability requirements. So, ancillary services support the reliable operation of the transmission system as it moves electricity from generating resources to the retail customer. Now, there are 4 ancillary services that are procured in the real-time market. So now, regulation corrects for short-term changes in electricity use that might affect the stability of the power system. These generators are under the ISO control through the AGC, which is the automatic generation control, which allows us to move these resources every 4 seconds. Operating reserves are capacity products designed to ensure reliability in the event of a grid disturbance. So let's say, for example, a huge generator goes offline unexpectedly. So now, spinning reserves are synchronized to the grid and available to be dispatched as energy within 10 minutes. These terms, non-spinning is not synchronized to the grid. So these terms originally referred to, if you think about the old turbine engines where you had to spin them up to get them going. So that's where the terms came from. But really what we're talking about is, are you connected to the grid and can you provide energy at the right frequency within 10 minutes? You're spinning or non-spinning. So what does this mean? Now, the ISO procures ancillary services and additional capacity for the ISO DayAhead to meet the reliability needs or requirements. So we have to make sure that, again, we talk about the governing bodies. So our procurement targets are set by the ISO, but they meet the WEC standards. Contingency reserves are based on the WEC standards, and then the RUC commitment is to meet the ISO system-wide and regional forecast, the residual unit commitment. So we have to make sure that we have all this information. But what is a residual unit commitment? We haven't covered that yet. I'm glad you asked. So let's talk about that. Now, the residual unit commitment is used to meet the ISO's energy forecast. So we showed you this screen before. So what happens when the amount of energy that clears the market is short of what the actual ISO demand is? Well, that's what the residual unit commitment process is for, is to cover that gap. So the residual unit commitment process is just that. It's to bridge the gap between what cleared in the day-ahead market to what we actually know the forecast is going to be. Now, if a resource is rewarded the RUC capacity, they will need to submit an energy bed in real time. Now, there'll be a payment for the capacity in day-ahead, and if we need the energy in real time, there will be an additional payment at the real-time price. That's how we keep that gap. But we also said that we have to make sure that it's a fair, competitive price, and we said we did that with market power mitigation. So another important step that we need to talk about is this market power mitigation. Now, when there are multiple resources available to serve in an area where prices are pretty competitive, but if there's only one resource available, that price may not be very competitive. And this would be known as market power. So for every hour, the day-ahead market runs a test to see if there are resources that potentially have market power. And if they do, then we need to mitigate it or reduce that. And if the potential for market power is determined, then it will be mitigated to a more reasonable price. And those bids are mitigated reduced cost bids. So how does that impact what we're talking about? And again, when we talk about the need for a fair, transparent energy price, this is how we do that. So now grid operators need to plan for the operating the next day to ensure reliability. So California uses the day-ahead market to procure energy ahead of time. And then if we need to meet those, then we have ancillary services to meet the reliability requirements at the time, and we have the real-time market for that. So now in order for us to understand that more, we really need to talk about economic bids and sell schedules. But before we get to that, let me pause here because we went through quite a bit of information with the RUC and the market power mitigation. So I'm going to pause for questions and see what questions we have.
Right, we do have a question in the chat. And it's from Abu. Can storage facilities be a spinning reserve?
I believe I have that answer, but Heidi, I'm going to defer to you to ensure I give the proper information.
So at this time, I believe that that's still, it will do, to be a spinning reserve, it would depend on how quickly it could produce that energy. Mm-hmm. So it would depend on if that storage facility has that capability. So, you know, the different resources can be, but it will have to be tested. It would have to be, you know, it would have to go through a series of tests to be able to ensure that it could be available at the time needed, you know, within the time frame. So if it's spinning, you know, it has to be up, running, available to be able to produce that energy. So it really depends on what the capability of that resource, that storage facility is.
Thank you, Heidi. Any additional questions?
And Rada just added an additional note, and she's one of our trainers, our lead trainers here, and she's been covering most of the storage training. Yes, storage can provide spinning reserves, and yes, in order to provide any of the ancillary services, a resource must be certified in order to do so. So thank you for that, Rada.
Thank you, Rada. Well, at this time, it is 9:55, so let's take a short 5-minute break. Let's be back at 10 o'clock. Get some water, stretch your legs. You may not hear any audio at this time, but we will start again at the top of the hour at 10 o'clock. So I look forward to talking to you shortly. And we are back. I hope everyone had a good break. I was able to get some water and stretch a little bit, so I'm ready to move on, but I just want to check and see, Heidi, did any additional questions come in while I was on break?
I do not see any new questions that have come in. I just wanted to follow up. Abu, do you feel like you got a question, an answer to your question before about what steps we take to make sure that we maintain that supply and demand, during a contingency condition, in preparation for a contingency condition? Do you feel like you got the answers that you were hoping for? Kind of. And, if you have a follow-up question, you're free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. But just kind of to clarify that we have a lot of different ways that we're always trying to make sure that we have resources available. So we, start planning a year in advance, sometimes before, with bilateral contracts that are going between the different entities. We have resource adequacy plans. We have ancillary service plans. So the demand and the supply sides both have to be sure that they're procuring the energy in advance, that they're demonstrating that they'll have the supply resources ready. So there's a lot of planning that goes on, and that's based on forecasts. That's based on not just forecasts for weather, but what are some historical things that have been going on. So there's as we get closer and closer to the date when actual energy is flowing, there's a lot of different things that are going on to make sure that we have enough capacity that's there available, and we procure extra. We make sure that there's extra available so that, when, like, what Rodney was talking about earlier with, when we get to the bidding, the supply and demand, we're making sure we have that. We have RUC to make sure that, if there's any gaps where we don't have enough supply to meet the load, or, or vice versa, then what kind of changes need to be made? What kind of gaps do we have? And then we have other things, that we have things called, flexible ramping product, where it's like there's some extra cushion as we get, closer and closer to actually flowing that energy. So it's kind of fine tuning. So there are a lot of different things that are going on, as we get closer and closer to that energy. And then Abu follows up, if there's a need to reduce generation from the grid, what factors considered to order a gen operator to reduce the load? So that's going on during the market optimization. So it's looking at all the resources that are in there. It's looking at system conditions, the forecasts that are being used. And then there are instructions that are being sent. And Rodney's going to get into the real-time market in a little bit to talk about the timing that those would happen. But there are instructions that are being sent, prior to the actual flowing of the energy to, make sure that they're being produced or reduced as necessary. But that's all based on the market optimization. So does that help? Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And like I said, Rodney's going to take you through the real-time market in a little bit. So that's going to show you how it's, it's really just being fine-tuned as we get closer and closer. So stay tuned for that. So back to you, Rodney. I don't see any other questions or any hands raised.
Thank you, Heidi. So earlier we talked about how we talk about running from bid all the way through settlements to ensure a smooth process. So we're going to talk about the first part of that, which are the economic bids and sell schedules. So let's take a look at what that means. Now, energy bids provide an economic signal indicating a participant's willingness to supply or purchase energy. So all of the day-ahead bids are submitted by scheduling coordinators. Now, when the scheduling coordinator submits a bid for a supply curve, they provide us with the quantity of megawatts they're willing to offer at various price points. Now, as the price increases, the quantity offered will also increase. So I'll give you 10 megawatts if the price is $20. but I'll give you 50 megawatts at the price of $100. Now, these prices are meant to reflect their cost of providing supply. Now, there's a bid cap of a soft bid cap of $1,000 and a bid floor of a negative $150. Now, the bid submitted must be within this range. Now, the scheduling coordinator for demand also submits bids by letting the market know how much they're willing to buy in terms of megawatts. So now, the lower the price, the more they're willing to buy, as denoted here on the graph. So now, sales schedules are also price takers. So participants have the ability to submit sales schedules, and these are the offers to either supply or buy, no matter what the price is. So, for example, a supplier could submit a sales schedule for 100 megawatts of energy. Now, this tells the market that they're planning on jittering 100 megawatts tomorrow, regardless of the price. Perhaps they have a contract with a load-serving entity to provide those megawatts. Now, on the other side of the coin, the load-serving entity could submit a sales schedule for 100 megawatts of demand in the day-ahead market. Now, this signals to the market that they're willing to buy at that, no matter what the price is, clears the market. Now, they might do this to ensure they have secure supply to serve their demand in advance of the real-time market, because they feel like the price may be higher in real time. So now the economic bids and sales schedules on this map here. Now, the sales schedules are at the beginning of the curve, and they are indifferent to the prices that will clear the market. So as I mentioned before, the place where a supply meets demand curve indicates where the amount of supply and demand clear the market. Now, any additional demand that shows up will be served by the real-time market at the real-time price. So if you look at the demand that is to the right side, the total cleared demand, these quantities will clear in the real time. So now, what if there are more than one resource that's bidding at the same price? How do we determine which resource to select? Well, let's talk about that. So in this example, there's 5 different resources that are bidding into the day-ahead market at $20. So what's the difference? Now, the bid suppliers have more than just bid prices for the energy. They also supply additional information such as the cost for the startup, so the startup cost, the minimum run time for the unit. Now, even though all these structures have a bid at $20, it may cost more to start up a gas fuel generator than a wind resource. So the market will award the wind resource in lieu of the gas fire generator, and additionally some different things to look at. So it may be cheaper to start up a resource and use one that's already running, or is it cheaper to keep the resource running at its physical minimum, its PMN, or to start up another one? So this is part of the market optimization that goes on for the real time in the day-ahead markets. Now, Heidi mentioned earlier about these things that go into, well, how do we know where to get the energy from and things like that? This is part of that process, and it's important to understand why this is important. So now, other inputs of the day-ahead market. The network model is like a map of the transmission lines, the load, and generation. It's like a roadmap of the system. Now, this provides the market with all of the options flowing into the transmission lines, and it sets the transmission supply in terms of megawatts. Now, we also need to know the attributes of all the resources that are submitting, and we have a database for that. So it's understanding what those are. So now, what is this information? It's going to give us the startup time, the ramp rates, how many times per day can be started up, how long you have to wait in between startups, the maximum number of megawatts you can produce, so the P max. This information informs the market of how the resource can be used. Now, forecasts are used to predict the needs for the next day, and these forecasts include demand forecasts as well as weather forecasts, providing insight into the energy requirements and also potential quantity of renewables that might be available. Now, if it's going to be windy for the day, maybe the turbines are used. Now, transmission outages and resources outages will impact the amount of megawatts that can flow, and the market uses this information in determining which resources can be awarded. Now, again, we talked about the timelines, so we just covered the day-ahead market, and now we're going to get into the real-time market. Now, again, you'll notice that it looks very similar, but the real-time market begins once the day-ahead market closes. So let's take a look at that process. Now, there are three main timelines in the real-time market. Bids from all market participants and base schedules from the EIM are submitted 75 minutes before each trade hour. These bids are used in the hourly processes for intertie transactions, the 15-minute market, the FMM, and the real-time dispatch, RTD, which occurs every 5 minutes. Now, the real-time market fine-tunes the flow of electricity to follow the fluctuations in real-time supply and demand. Now, as we move into the real-time market, at least 5 hours ahead, we look at our updated forecast and begin committing resources as necessary. Now, from the time the day-ahead market schedules are posted to 75 minutes before the trade hour, bids can be submitted for the real-time market. The HAS, the hour-ahead scheduling process, is a process for scheduling energy and ancillary services based on submitted bids by the imports. Now, internal resources will receive advisory schedules for the next hour, and then imports and exports will receive their financially binding commitments. Now, our RUC process is the ISO makes the final decisions on resource commitments to adjust the day-ahead schedules. Now, energy is paid in day-ahead or real-time prices based on where the award was received. And that's important to understand when we get into the settlements portion. You're settled out where the energy was, where the transaction took place. So inputs into the real-time market include day-ahead results, resource parameters, real-time system information, energy bids, outage information, and the transmission line information. The market results generate the real-time dispatches, ancillary service awards, and startup and shutdown instructions. The 5-minute time frame, the 5-minute prices are set, and energy is then dispatched. And now I see that there's a question here, Heidi. What is the question there?
The question is there ever a scenario where there are only self-schedules at a given location? If so, how would the price quantity clear in that scenario?
And then what would be the proper answer for that, Heidi?
So when Rodney was showing you the clearing price earlier, you know, how it's determined, self-schedules are the ones that are entered with megawatt only and no price. So those are given, you know, those are set at the front of the economic curve. So when this price is being determined, it's looking at, you know, at the whole, at the totality of all of the resources that, you know, are in the market that are being bid in and being, you know, the supply and the demand. So anything that's a self-schedule, that's going to be, you know, zero value. So it means you're a price taker. You're going to take whatever price there is. Therefore, that's why they're placed at the beginning of the economic curve. They're going to be the ones that are probably going to be consumed the first, you know, because you're probably going to be able to, you know, get that energy at the cheapest price, you know, whether your load or the supply. So I don't know if that, you know, so it's looking at, and that's setting the energy price that's going, you know, and that's the energy that's part of the LMP. It's just the base energy portion of that price. It's applied to anyone that's awarded during that particular interval. So, you know, to have it be, you know, where there's only self-schedules, that would have to be across the board. You know, so that's, you know, probably would not happen. So you're still going to end up with that price quantity that's going to clear based on, you know, taking all of the bids that are in the market, putting those self-schedules at the beginning of the curve, and then, you know, with all the other bids and everything. So, yeah, and the energy price across the ISO, you're saying it's not an LMP. That's a part of the LMP, and I believe you're going to cover that later, the LMP. So you'll see where that fits into the locational marginal price. There are different components that all make up the LMP. This is just one piece of it that sets that price. So good question, Joe. And when we get a little further, you know, that'll be able to put that all into perspective. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Heidi. So now just to tie a bow around this. So again, the real-time market is hourly processes, and we talked about the market power mitigation, the short-term unit commitment. and the 15-minute market. But we also are going to look at the real-time manual dispatch. We have the real-time economic dispatch. We have the real-time contingency dispatch. So all these things are run. Some of these are determined as needed. So it's these processes that go into making sure that the grid is reliable and that it's meeting the questions that you guys are asking about. Well, what about this, or how do these things go into place? If you look at the screen, all these things are happening every hour to ensure that the grid is running at the right frequency and has the supply to meet the demand in a real-time basis. So let's look at this reliability that I just mentioned. So again, we are responsible for the constant reliable flow for the health and safety and welfare of the consumers. We are all the consumers of this energy. So maintaining the reliability is a balancing act that we have to really exercise and control so many moving parts. It's critical for us to take a look at those. And then the system operation supports grid reliability. So what does that look like? Here's an example. Our operators are responsible for maintaining the reliability grid and balancing supply and against the demand using the various resources. So we showed you the example where we have all these resources that are bidding in at the same price, but there's also just different resources in different areas. How do we manage all of that? The operators are located in 2 control centers which continuously connect in real time through instant video conferencing. So now both control rooms are operated 24/7, and though Folsom is the primary control, we do have one in Lincoln, so that way, control can be transferred between the 2 control rooms at any time. Now there are multiple redundancies in place, so that way we have a really high level of dependability in the computer system operations. Now, as I mentioned before, the reliability grid is the primary focus. So the grid is a commodity that is produced, delivered, and consumed at the speed of light. That's how it works. And though this process is very complex, the goal is to maintain grid frequency at 60 hertz in order to keep it safely running. Now, electricity is produced by the supply, which consists of generation and imports. Electricity delivered via transmission and distribution lines and then consumed by demand, which are the load and exports. Now, maintaining the balance between these two is like driving your car at 60 miles per hour on the freeway. How do you do that? So if you need to increase, you put the gas on. If you need to decrease, then you take your foot off the gas. Now, because of its instantaneous nature, the ISO uses technology to take a pulse of the system every few seconds, and the system operators that we just talked about can constantly monitor the multiple pieces of data and all this information to instantly react to fluctuating situations such as change in weather that's going on or supply shortfalls and surpluses. So we have to make sure that we have reserves available to meet those changes, and it's important that we do that. So entities can participate through market products and different services to help ensure that. Now, how we do that, we're going to have different ways we can do that. So the physical supply and demand are the bids for resources have the ability to provide actual physical energy into the bulk electric system. Now, convergence bids or virtual supply and demand bids, they're just financial positions only. So what their job is to do, convergence bidding is to reduce the average price between the day-ahead and the real-time market, because if you can hedge your bet about where the prices are going to be, by making that gap close, which is the convergence, it allows us to ensure that the prices are better. Now, ancillary services are considered capacity products and help maintain the reliability of the grid by ensuring that we have additional resources held back in reserve, so that way we have the ability to handle different types of contingency events. So whether it's short-term regulation or the operational needs that must be covered within a 10-minute window. Now, we talked about the residual unit commitment, and again, this is designed to enough capacity to meet the day-ahead forecast by bridging the gap between what physically cleared and then what the day-ahead market compared to what the actual forecast is. Now, Heidi mentioned this term before, which is the flexible ramping product, and that provides additional upward or downward flexible ramping capability to account for uncertainty due to the demands and renewable forecast errors or in the real-time market. So it ensures that we have some capacity that's available to be dispatched either up or down depending on what we need. So as we mentioned earlier, the ISO is now providing reliability coordination for the Western Interconnection. Now, the congestion revenue rights are financial instruments that are made available through allocation and auction process that enables rights holders to manage congestion cost variability based on the LMP, the location of marginal pricing. So Heidi was talking about this in the last slide. These rights are required primarily for offsetting congestion costs that occur in the day-ahead market. Now, if you want more information about that, we do have some web-based trainings that give you information to these congestion revenue rights, and you can find that at the Learning Center on the KISO.com. Now, inter-SE trades are an optional accounting service that we offer that were transactions between entities. So again, what is that we do? Participation in the ISO depends on the services to be provided. So though there are many ways to interact with the ISO, only scheduling coordinators authorize to transact business directly with the ISO. So now a scheduling coordinator is an entity authorized by the ISO to buy and sell power in the ISO markets. Now, SE bids are scheduled, they're supplied into the market or supply demands, submit the demand bids, and then based on the awards, energy flows across the transmission system and is then distributed to the customer by local utilities. Now, if an entity chooses to not become a scheduling coordinator, you need to contract the services of a certified scheduling coordinator to participate on their behalf. Now, SCs may include convergence bidders, demand response providers, utility-owned generation, independent generators, EIM participants. Now, power marketers are entities that do not own or use generation, but act as brokers or sellers between power sellers and power buyers. So the SC certification process has requirements. So these requirements include mandatory trainings, financial and testing requirements, as well as ongoing adherence to policies. Now, for more information on this, you can visit the ISO website and you can refer to the business practice manuals, and that information will be included in this deck when we send it out. Now, the EIM, we've talked about that before, which is the Energy Imbalance Market, is an extension of ISO's real-time market offered to any balancing authority in the western area of North America. Now, it provides low-cost, low-risk option that balances load and resources automatically and economically. Now, full market members seamlessly participate in both the day-ahead and real-time markets, while EIM entities only participate in the real-time. Now, participants are able to submit bids which will be utilized by the ISO to optimize energy transfer and generation and output between all the EIM entities in both 15 and 5-minute increments. Now, the EIM's objective is to minimize the total cost by serving energy demands of the entire EIM area while simultaneously respecting the boundaries between the balancing authority areas and the responsibilities of the entities that manage them and the transmission rights associated with them. Now, the ISO operates the EIM in the West and uses advanced ISO market systems, which automatically choose the low-cost resources to reliably meet customer needs. Now, we have several participants in the EIM, and we have more adding all the time. So what is the EIM and why is it important for us? So if you look at not being part of the EIM, this is the example here out on the left. You're going to have a limited pool of balancing resources. You're going to have high level of reserves. There's going to be a lot of economic inefficiencies, and there's going to be increased costs for integration. But if you're part of the EIM, which dispatches resources across all the BAA, now you have a diversity of the balancing resources. You have decreased flexibility reserves, but you have more economic efficiency. And you have decreased the integration costs, because the entities are still responsible for running their own BAAs. So this is these shared resources, and the ability to be more economical is the driving force behind this. So we talked about the day-ahead market, we talked about the real-time market, and now we're going to get into the post-market, which is going to include settlements. So let me pause right here and see if we have any questions about the markets before we move into post-market.
I am looking and I don't see any questions coming into the chat yet. Also taking a look, I don't see any hands raised to ask a verbal question. All right.
Thank you, Heidi. Then I will move into post-market then.
Sounds great.
So let's talk about the post-market and the financial things that take place. Now, each market transaction is distinct and will be accounted for separately in the stack of coded transactions and the associated prices based on the market activity and then data pulled from the meters. So if we look at a day in the life of the participating resource. Now remember that CAISO runs as a profit neutral, so we act just as a clearinghouse for the financial transactions and all the activities that we talked about so far. Now this means that we need to account for all the actions the market participants take and all the market and reliability operation processes, and we do that through a very robust settlements process. Now the next few slides are going to demonstrate at a high level what these processes are. Now, the image on this slide provides a high-level depiction of the activities which occur in the day-ahead and real-time markets. So it begins with the market participants taking various positions by submitting bids and schedules, and after all the participant activities have completed, the market processes run, provide optimizations, result in lower cost solutions, while still meeting local reliability needs, and this is done every hour of every day. The transactions for the multiple time intervals are then recorded on settlement statements by trade date, and then to really get down to the business or the settlements and what that looks like, we're going to jump into the next slide. So now settlements are broken down by applicable markets. So our day-ahead and real-time markets are settled financially in the post-market process. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the ISO market results are stacked like pancakes. So what happens in the day ahead stays in day ahead. Real-time changes to schedule and their associated prices will be stacked separately for accounting purposes for both the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. Entities can review all of these market transactions on their individual statements, which we'll talk about next. Now, this diagram simplifies the energy statements for the day-ahead market into real time in this example. Now, this resource was awarded 120 megawatts in the day-ahead market. When the market began optimization, this resource was awarded an additional 24 megawatts. In the 15-minute market, more processes were run as we got closer to delivery time, and they were awarded an additional 12 megawatts were awarded in real time. So 120 will be paid at the day-ahead price. The additional 24 will be paid at the 15-minute market price. And then the final 12 will be paid on top of that, we paid at the real-time market price. Now, again, this is a very simplified example of what happens with the transaction from the initial day-ahead award to the incremental FMM and then the real-time dispatch awards, and that occur will be listed separately on the statement. Now, of course, there's a lot more settlements than this example provides, since each transaction accounted for separately that are based on the detailed calculations that we'll still talk about in the next coming up slides. The one thing that I would like to just point out is the example here on the screen, the big thing right in the middle of the page. This is an example of a 1 hour interval, and this happens each hour of every day for every day that the market operates. So you can see how this gets really complex, and the need to have a very detailed system on how to do this is why this is important. Now, one of the most critical data pieces to the settlements process is the actual meter data, because it tells us what actually happened in the real-time flow of energy. Now, meter data is used for billable quantities to represent the energy generated or consumed during each settlement interval. Now, meter data is collected in one of two ways. The meter can be directly pulled by the ISO or sent in by the SC for the purpose of reporting the actual performance of the resource. Now, the additional data that comes from the meters is considered raw data, also known as revenue quality meter data. But what is needed to be consumed by the ISO settlements is settlement quality meter data, also known as SQMD. Now, the revenue quality meter data is converted into settlement quality meter data by putting it through our V process, which is validation, estimation, and editing. Now, it is important for meter data to be accurate and ensure the accurate settlement results. Therefore, a meter installation certification process by the ISO is authorized to manually inspect and initially go in and make sure that the meters are up to standard. Because again, the data must be correct, and we need the settlement quality data to make sure we have the most accurate information available. So now the settlement process, market activity, produce payments and charges. So settlements are the calculations, billing, and invoices of the charges and payments for market and transmission-related activities between market participants and the ISO. Now, the settlement cycle follows a specific timeline and processes for publication of statements, invoices and payment advices, and dispute submittals and payments. Now, DayAhead results and real-time results, along with the meter data, flow through the settlements process and an output for a settlement statement for each trade date. Now, formulas are associated with each charge code to determine how transactions are to be settled, and these calculations are broken down on the daily settlement statements. Then collected into weekly invoices, which identify charges to be remitted, payment advices that will show what will be paid out, and then you get your settlement statements. So now timelines are critical to settling in the market efficiently. Each entity will receive a series of settlement statements by the trade date. Initial settlement statements are only an estimate of the final result, and marginal adjustments may be needed several months after the actual trade date. Now, invoices or payment advices for market transactions are published weekly on Wednesdays, today, and include market transactions from trading days Monday through Sunday from the previous week. Now, invoices are due for payments by 10 a.m. the following Tuesday. Payment advices are then dispersed as applicable at 2 p.m. that same Tuesday afternoon. Now, as the ISO is a not-for-profit organization, all the money that comes into the market gets dispersed back into the market, with the exception of our GMC, or the grid management charges, that cover our specified operating costs. Now, this diagram depicts the daily settlement timelines, which show how many times one trade date will be processed for adjustments and accurate calculations. Now, this slide shows the timeline as it is today, and I do want to point out that we have a current market settlement timeline initiative that will be making changes to these dates. Now, again, to stay up on to date with this process, we do encourage you to visit the stakeholder process page to learn more about upcoming changes to this process. But as it stands now, T+3, or the trade date plus 3 business days, is the first estimated statement that is produced by the reporting system. The next time this data will be processed for updates or changes will be at T+12, or 12 business days, which will include any meter data submitted by T+8 business days. Now, there are also subsequent statements that are published periodically thereafter. There may or may not be adjustments in the future settlement statements, but entities will only be responsible for the amount that changes from the previous settlement. For more information on this, there are, again, CBTs in the Learning Center for you guys to get some information on the settlements process. Now, a key point that the data must be submitted on time in order to allow these statements processed is more effectively and quickly. Now, late meter data impacts the settlement statement for the entire market. Therefore, we have rules of conduct in place to outline specific requirements and the expectations for these market participants. So let me pause there and let's see what questions we have.
Right now, I'm not seeing, oh, here we go. We've got a question from David Person. Sorry, it's a bit late. Are there any plans to address concerns regarding the disparity between the diversity of EIM participants versus the California-only governance structure? Is the ISO or California legislature interested, resistant in changing EIM governance, or is the ISO just going to focus on the voluntary nature of participation, like it or leave it? Possibility of EIM governance that is quasi-independent of ISO. I'll go ahead and take this one, Rodney. This is something that continues to evolve. So we do have meetings that are ongoing where we continue to discuss EIM governance. We've been reaching out, like in our policies and initiatives that we're coming up with, to make sure that the EIM governing body has much more of a say, it has some input into our processes. So we're, I don't see any plans to do to make people maintain themselves in the EIM structure. That's going to be completely voluntary, just as we're expanding our extended day-ahead market to, we just kicked off that project and we're going to be extending that to the EIM entities as well. That will be on a participatory, you'll be wanting to participate as opposed to have to participate. So we continue this evolution. There's a lot of talks that are going on. If you're interested in attending any of the meetings to see where those are going, we do have the Western Energy Imbalance Market website that you can go to. There's a calendar of events where you can listen in on the governance meetings. Like I said, it's continuing to evolve and continuing to see what's best for all of the different entities as we really start to look at, how do we work together even better as a region. So stay tuned. It's an evolution. Hopefully that answers your question. We have another question from Joe Alves. For energy sold this week, Monday through Sunday, when would the seller be paid? Do you want to go with that one, or do you want Rodney?
I will defer to you on that one, Heidi.
Okay. So if you could go back to the timing slide for settlements. So as you see here, that would be, every Wednesday, that's when the entities are going to receive invoices or payment advices. So if you get an invoice, that means you're going to have to pay. If you get a payment advice, that means you're going to be receiving money back from the market. So that's for those trading dates, Monday through Sunday. And then by that next Tuesday, that's why we require that the payments are due by 10 a.m. so that, the market has that time. We can go through process, and then, so anybody who has that invoice has to have that paid no later than 10 a.m. on Tuesday in order for us to turn around and send that money back out to anybody who should be paid by that afternoon by 2 o'clock. So that's why timing is so important for getting that money paid into the market so that the market can pay that back out. Does that help, Joe? And David, I hope that answered your question. If you have any other questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me. You can send a follow-up question, or you can reach out to me, Heidi Carter, and we can talk a little bit more about that, about the governance. And good, thank you, Joe. Really appreciate it. Do we have any other questions that you want to ask Rodney? And also you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask a question verbally if you'd like. Okay, thanks, David. And David responded, totally understand the evolving governance issues. I think it's reflective of the success of the EIM as a whole. And I completely agree. It's as, all of our states are moving toward these, the goals of decarbonization, of using renewable resources, we all really need to rely on one another and work together. So EIM, I think, has been a good practice in doing that and seeing where we can benefit on utilizing each other's resources and understanding that, it's not one organization making all the rules, that we really need to come together. So there's a lot of efforts. We have our department that deals with regulatory state affairs. They're doing a lot of outreach and, evolution in this, and trying to really, we work with our state board as well, our state legislature, to help them understand that this really is going to have to be collaborative in order for us to maintain the reliability with those decarbonization goals that we have. So thanks for that. That's good feedback. Appreciate that. All right. No other questions that I see right now, Rodney. So if you want to continue.
Thank you, Heidi. So we talked about there's places to get more information. So the California ISO website is a great place to get information that is going to help you not only learn more, but stay informed. So if you look here, the resources tab is where you can start. When I told you about the stakeholders page, that information can be found here. When we talk about participate, stay informed, these are all the areas that you can click on to get more information. There's drop-down menus, so you can find information, and that way you can stay up to date on the information. Meetings, notices, the things that come out, you will see here in the calendar. So that way, again, you can know ahead of time how to plan for things, where you should be involved. And again, you can use this in conjunction with the stakeholders page, different things like that. Today's Outlook is a really fascinating piece of information because it's going to tell you, as of right now, what the current demand is, what the forecasted is, how much of that is renewables. So it's really going to be, for those of us like me that really enjoy this information, to see, well, what's going on in the world of energy today outside of just, well, I can turn on my light. It's what's the demand, and then I'm very curious to see, well, what percentage of that is renewables? How are we integrating that into the market? So that can be found here at today's Outlook. We have additional websites that are down here at the bottom that can give you information, take you to different places. Now, some of these are going to require certificates, so you need to be either a serving entity or things like that, so that way you can get into, for example, the Western EIM portal, the market participant portal, things like that. But it'll give you information that's going to be relevant to what you're looking for. Also, you're going to be able to have the information. So we have some of the key topics, things that are available to you. The quick links down at the bottom is going to give you links to, as you can see here, like who's on the board. We mentioned the BPM, so some of these things are really specific. So if you want to find the BPMs, there's a link down here at the bottom. And then you also have bulletins for the latest reports up here at the top. Now, there have been some questions about the EIM. Information can be found here at the Western EIM site. I really encourage you to go here and read some information. It is such a benefit to have the Western EIM and to be able to be part of that group, and you can see some of those benefits, and it'll be listed here about what the benefits are. You can also find out more information about the reliability coordinator, because remember we started this in November of 2019, and you can find more information here at this page. Now, there's different information here. I would suggest you look at this. We talked about the complexity of the job. So you'll notice here, there are a couple of different rooms, a couple of different videos here on how to really understand what these guys do. I am someone who craves knowledge, so looking at this is going to give you so much information about, wow, there's so many things that go on that you're just not aware of that help contribute to the energy being on and the lights being on in your house. So we have two videos here. One is for your operations. The other one is for market operations. The OASIS, which is the Open Access Same Time Information System, provides public access to a variety of transmission system data. So this is going to give you capacity status, market prices, market results data. Now, while some of the information is proprietary, there is a great deal of information available to the public, and it allows for the data to be pulled and used by anyone or anybody that has a need for that information. Now, again, we talked about today's Outlook, and just give you an example of some of the things that you could find there. We talked about the demand. We talked about the prices up here. So you can see the prices up here. And that was a question before. We talked about the LMP prices versus the energy for the entire CAISO serving area. You can talk about here where supply, here's the current demand. And this is one of the things I love is like how it impacts, our current CO2 footprint, what our renewables are. All this is information that's publicly available to really drive home how transparent we are and how much we are stakeholder driven and how much we want you guys to be a part of the process. Now, again, the BPMs are the rules that govern us with the tariffs. And so what we want to make sure is we give you guys this information. Again, you can find this. These links will be available in this presentation, but you can also get this information straight from the CAISO website. Now, you can sign up for the daily briefing to get a once-a-day summary email of what's happening at the CAISO, You can sign up for that here. The information is right here on the screen, and you can subscribe to it, and it'll give you the information. It's going to bring it right to you, so that way you have access to the information at your fingertips. And you can also check out our news page to find up-to-date information on the topics that are listed here. I strongly encourage you guys to take a look at this, because it does help. I remember in the summertime, I signed up for these alerts, and it let me know when we are going to be in a time where we should conserve energy, which is really helpful for me, because I want to do my part to reduce my consumption during peak times. So yes, I was shutting off my air conditioner for hours on end to help relieve some of the grid congestion and make sure energy is available for those consumers that need it. Now, the ISO has created a dedicated developer site to enhance the customer service. So we did this to simplify doing business with the ISO. So we provide a comprehensive website for developers that consolidates the technical documentation developers need, giving them the APIs, find connectivity instructions, and we also have interface definition files, sample code, URLs. We give you the information you need so you can work with us as a developer. So you can sign up for that and make sure you have the information available to you. Now, I mentioned several times about the web-based trainings, the CBTs. You can find those here to make sure that you get the information. So you go in, it's under participate, you go to the Learning Center, and you can see the information. They are broken down into different sections. So if you notice here, some of the examples, we talked about settlements. Settlements is right here. There's outages here. You can get more information about the different markets. So we want to supplement the information I gave you here. This is just a little taste. This is the appetizer. You guys can go in and get some more information and really drive home your information and to find some of the other recordings here also. Now, here are the links that are provided, and we have the reference slides that they're available to you. So if you guys are taking notes along the way and something caught your eye and you want to know where to find that information, we're going to give you those links here so you don't have to go back through and look for it. This is a resource guide at the end. And then the links to the transmission planning process and generation interconnection process, we give you those here also. Our goal is to make this information as user-friendly as possible, so that way it becomes a benefit to you. And if you guys have questions, you can reach out to us. Customer readiness at kaiso.com is a great place to go. And you can also see here, you can use the contact us at the Kaiso website. So before I close, Heidi, what information would you like to add? And are there any additional questions before I close this up?
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. If you would like to ask a verbal question, please raise your hand, or feel free to add any more questions in the chat. I did put the link to the Learning Center that's in there. You can find the presentation that is located under the Markets tab. So, and like Rodney said, we recorded this, so it will be posted. We'll be updating that with this latest video. The video that's on there right now is from the last quarter when this class was delivered. So I just wanted to thank you all very much. I did make a note to sign up for the daily briefing. We have a lot of things that are going with the extended day ahead market, with initiatives that are, impacting a lot of the different entities, both for EIM, for the scheduling coordinators, that are participating with the ISO. So the daily briefing is a really good way to kind of get that one shot a day to, find out what meetings are coming up, what are the different initiatives. It might have settlements issues that are going on. So whatever your interest is, it's a really great way to get a quick look at that. So thank you very much to everyone for asking the questions, for participating, and Rodney again for sharing great information. So I'll turn it back to you. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Heidi. And I would like to thank everyone for their participation again today. Like Heidi said, the training is so much more impactful for you when you guys are able to ask your questions in real time. So I appreciate the participation. If you guys do have additional questions, you can email us here at Customer Readiness. I like providing information. That's why we do what we do here as instructors. So please don't feel like, oh, well, it's an easy question. No, please ask, because we can either give you the resources or help you understand some of the nuances and what it is that we do. So I really appreciate your guys' time today. As Heidi said, we will post this video. We'll update the presentation with any additional questions and information. We'll add this presentation, and then you guys feel free to contact us if you have any questions. But I thank you guys, and you guys have a good rest of your day. Thank you for joining today.